I almost didn't go that day. That's the thing that still gets me when I think about it. My alarm went off at 6:30, and I lay there staring at the water stain on the ceiling of my Paddington hotel room thinking, it's just a palace. I've seen pictures. I don't need to stand in the cold to see something I've already seen on a screen. But something pulled me. I don't know what. Call it instinct. Call it boredom. Call it the fact that I'd paid good money to be in London for 5 days and I'd already wasted 2 of them eating biscuits and watching British panel shows in bed. So I got up. I pulled on my jacket, the grey one, the one my sister said made me look like a geography teacher, and I grabbed my camera bag. Not a professional camera, just my old Canon that I've had since university. The strap is fraying at the edges. My mum keeps telling me to get a new one. I never listen. It was early October. That specific kind of October morning that London does where the sky can't quite decide if it wants to rain or just threaten to. There was that thin grey light that makes everything look like an old photograph. The air had that bite to it, the kind that wakes you up properly before your coffee does. I took the tube to St. James's Park Station. Came up the steps and just stopped for a second. There's something about that part of London that hits differently in the morning. Before the tour buses. Before the crowds thicken and the selfie sticks come out. When it's still mostly locals walking their dogs through the park, and the pigeons haven't yet learned that today's tourists haven't arrived to feed them yet. I walked through the park slowly. The lake was still, almost perfectly still, with a mist sitting just above the surface of the water. A pelican, and I didn't even know they had pelicans there, someone had to tell me later, was standing on a rock doing absolutely nothing, like it owned the whole city. Maybe it did. By the time I got to the mall and turned the corner toward Buckingham Palace, there were maybe 40, 50 people already gathered along the railings. Not a mob. Not yet. Just the early risers. The dedicated ones. A Japanese couple with matching anoraks. An older American man in a red baseball cap who was telling his wife something she clearly wasn't listening to. 2 teenage girls who were doing that thing teenagers do where they're physically present but mentally somewhere else entirely, scrolling through their phones. And then, there was him. I noticed the guard before I even consciously registered what I was looking at. He was stationed just to the right of the central gate, not in one of the famous sentry boxes, but standing in that open ground, mid-position, with his bearskin hat and his red tunic and that rifle held just so against his shoulder. Perfectly still. Like something painted into the scene. I'd seen guards before. I'm not one of those tourists who'd never left their hometown. But there was something about the way this one stood. The stillness wasn't just trained, it was almost absolute. Like he'd decided, right down to his bones, that nothing in this world was going to move him. His name, I found out much later, was not something I was ever officially told. In the video that eventually made the rounds online, someone in the comments claimed he was called Thomas. I don't know if that's true. But I've thought of him as Thomas ever since, so that's what I'll call him. Thomas was young. I could tell even from a distance, even under the hat. There was something about the jawline, the posture of someone who's learned precision but hasn't yet forgotten what it felt like before that. He couldn't have been more than 23, 24. He stood there. And we watched. And that was fine. That was normal. The first half hour was actually lovely. I walked around a bit. Got a few shots of the palace in that flat gray morning light, which honestly was better than sunshine for photography, the shadows weren't harsh. A couple of pigeons landed near my feet and I negotiated with them for a while. The American man in the red cap had found someone who would listen to him, a young backpacker from what sounded like Sweden, and they were having the kind of conversation that only happens between strangers in tourist spots. I was just starting to think about getting a coffee and heading toward the gift shop. I needed something for my nephew, he's mad about anything royal, when I heard a sound that didn't quite fit. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just wrong. A laugh. But not the casual kind of laugh you hear in a crowd. Something sharper. A bit performative. I turned. And there was Marcus. That's not his real name. I don't know his real name. But, in my memory, he is absolutely a Marcus. He was maybe mid-30s, heavy-set, wearing a bright yellow waterproof jacket that belonged more on a hiking trail than outside a royal palace. He had one of those compact cameras, the kind people buy thinking they're getting a proper camera, but it's really just a slightly better phone hanging around his neck. And he was with a woman I assumed was his wife or girlfriend, who was already looking at him with that expression. You know the one. The please don't expression. He was maybe 3 meters from Thomas when I first noticed him. He was laughing about something he was filming on his phone. Not at Thomas, not yet. Just loudly existing in Thomas's space. Now here's the thing about the guards that most tourists know, or should know: there are signs. There are actual, physical signs telling you how close you can get. Where the boundary is. What is and isn't acceptable. And, beyond the signs, if you've got any kind of common sense or have done even 30 seconds of reading before visiting, you understand that these guards are not props. They're not mannequins hired to stand still while you take photos. They are on active military duty. That rifle isn't decorative. Marcus, it seemed, had not read the signs. Or had read them and decided they were more of a suggestion. He stepped forward. Not a huge step. Not aggressive, exactly. More the way someone steps forward when they're just trying to get a slightly better angle for a photo. Just a small adjustment. Just a little closer. I saw Thomas's eyes move. That was the first thing. The eyes. He hadn't moved anything else. Not a finger, not a shoulder. But his eyes had tracked to Marcus, and there was something in them, not anger, not yet, but something like awareness. Like a sensor that had just registered a signal. Marcus didn't notice. He was too busy holding up his phone and saying something to his companion about the light, how the light wasn't quite right. Could she stand over here? No, over here. He took another step. And that's when the woman beside him, the please don't woman, reached out and touched his arm. Marcus, she said. Or whoever his name was. I couldn't hear it from where I stood, but I could read it in the shape of her face. The way she pulled at his sleeve. The way she glanced toward Thomas with a kind of preemptive apology in her eyes. But, Marcus, and, I am telling you, the world is full of Marcuses. Marcus waved her off. He held up his phone and he moved forward one more time. And Thomas moved. Not the way you'd expect. Not a lunge, not a shout. Nothing dramatic. Just one step forward, and a sound. That sound. If you've ever heard a royal guard give a warning, you don't forget it. It's not a polite request. It's not customer service. It's something ancient and absolute, this command that comes up from the chest and lands like a full stop at the end of a sentence that is not open for discussion. Make way for the Queen's Guard. The whole crowd snapped to attention like someone had cut the volume on everything else. Conversation stopped mid-word. Children grabbed their parents' hands. The Swedish backpacker jumped visibly. Even the pigeons, I swear, paused. Marcus froze. The phone dropped to his side. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, there was this suspended silence where the entire scene hung in the air. And then, Thomas took one more measured step forward, and Marcus took 3 steps back, and the crowd parted around him like water, and everyone was suddenly very clear about where the boundary was. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. But, I'll tell you honestly, those 4 seconds felt like they had their own gravity. Like the world had briefly paused to let something important happen. I had my camera raised without even realizing I'd lifted it. I don't think I got the shot, my hands were shaking slightly, which almost never happens. But, I remember looking through the viewfinder at Thomas's face, and what I saw there wasn't anger, wasn't triumph. It was just duty. Complete and unshakable. He stepped back into his position. Reset his posture. Set his eyes forward again. And he became a statue once more. You know what's strange about moments like that? After the adrenaline drops, after the crowd remembers how to breathe and people start shuffling and murmuring and finding their cameras again. After all of that, there's this weird collective impulse to process what just happened by talking to the nearest stranger. I've thought about that since. How a shared jolt of something real just opens people up. Like for a few minutes after, everyone in that crowd was slightly more human to each other. The woman next to me, late 50s, sensible shoes, a cloth tote bag with the Tate Modern logo on it, leaned over and said, quietly but with great satisfaction, "Well, that'll be a lesson." And I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes out because something is genuinely funny and also genuinely true. Marcus, for his part, had retreated to what I can only describe as the emotional penalty box. He was standing about 6 feet further back than anyone else, arms folded, jaw set, doing that thing men do when they've been publicly corrected and haven't quite figured out how to process it. His companion, the please don't woman, was talking to him in that low, careful voice that is not so much a conversation as a de-escalation strategy. A few people nearby were already checking their phones. I suspected some of them had filmed it. Sure enough, later that evening I found 3 separate clips on social media, all from slightly different angles, all of them showing that same moment: Thomas stepping forward, Marcus stepping back, the crowd parting. The comments were something. Some people were applauding Thomas. Others were criticizing Marcus in terms I won't repeat. A few were doing that thing where they perform outrage on behalf of tourists' feelings, which always baffles me. And then, there were the ones just writing "Make way for the Queen's Guard" in caps with a string of crying laughing emojis, which, honestly, was the correct response. But, here's the part that doesn't make it into the videos. What happened next? I stayed. I don't know why I stayed when most of the crowd started to disperse and drift toward the gift shops or the cafe in the park. Maybe I was still running on that adrenaline. Maybe I just wasn't ready to leave. I found a spot on a low wall nearby where I could still see Thomas from a comfortable, very clearly appropriate distance, and I just sat. About 10 minutes passed. Maybe 15. The crowd thinned. The morning got a little brighter, the sun was making a cautious attempt through the cloud cover, the way the English sun does, like it's not entirely sure it's welcome. A new set of tourists arrived. An older couple, Eastern European, I guessed from the snippets of language I caught. They had a small granddaughter with them, maybe 4 or 5 years old, bundled up in a bright red coat. She was at that age where everything is still astonishing. Where the world is still enormous and every new thing is the most interesting thing she has ever seen. She saw Thomas and stopped walking. Just stopped. Completely. Like her little feet had made a decision independent of the rest of her. She stared at him. He was extraordinary, I suppose, to a child. The hat. The uniform. The absolute stillness. Something from a storybook, suddenly, real and standing in front of her. Her grandmother said something, gesturing toward the palace, but the girl wasn't listening. She was fixed on Thomas with the total concentration that small children have, the kind adults spend years trying to get back through meditation. And then, she did something that made my chest do something uncomfortable. She raised her tiny hand. And she waved at him. One small, slow wave. Like she was hoping he might wave back, but she wasn't entirely sure he was real enough to try it. Thomas, of course, did not move. But I was watching his face from the angle I was sitting at, and I want to be careful about how I say this because I know what I thought I saw, and I know some people will say I was imagining it. The very corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. Just a fraction. Here and gone in half a second. It wasn't a smile. Not exactly. But it was something. Some tiny acknowledgement that existed beneath the duty, beneath the training, beneath the bearskin hat and the centuries of protocol. Some small, human flicker. The little girl's grandfather took her hand gently and led her a few steps away to look at the gates, and she went willingly, casting one last look over her shoulder at Thomas like she was committing him to memory. I looked away, back at my camera. I wasn't even sure what I was doing with it anymore. I scrolled back through the shots I'd taken that morning. Some decent ones of the park. A good one of the Pelican. A blurry, handshaky almost shot of the confrontation. And then, somehow, a perfect one. I didn't even remember taking Thomas in the background, in full focus, with the little girl in her red coat in the foreground, tiny and blurred, one hand raised mid-wave. I still have that photograph. It's on my wall. The thing about the confrontation, and I've had months now to think about it, is that people keep framing it as a dramatic showdown. The videos make it look that way. The music people put underneath it, the slow zooms, the dramatic cuts. But I was there. And what I actually witnessed wasn't drama for drama's sake. It was something much simpler and much harder to explain. Discipline. Real discipline. The kind that isn't about ego or power or wanting to be the loudest person in the room. The kind that comes from having decided, somewhere deep down, that your role matters. That what you're protecting matters. That the boundary you're holding is not about you, personally, at all. Thomas didn't step forward because Marcus annoyed him. He didn't shout because he wanted the crowd to look at him. He stepped forward because someone crossed a line, and his job, his entire presence there, was to ensure that line meant something. That distinction felt important to me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. I'm a secondary school teacher. English. 11 to 18-year-olds. And I spend a lot of my days thinking about authority, what makes it real, what makes it hollow, why students respect some teachers and not others. And, watching Thomas that morning, I thought, that's the thing. The thing I've been trying to understand. Authority isn't loudness. It isn't size or aggression or the threat of consequence. It's conviction. The quiet, absolute certainty that what you're doing matters. The kids in my classroom can smell the difference between someone who believes in what they're doing and someone who's just going through the motions. They always could. Thomas believed in it. Every cell of him. I ended up having a conversation, later that morning, with a woman named Diane. She was in her early 60s, retired, had been living in London for most of her adult life and came to St. James's Park most mornings to walk. She'd seen the confrontation from a slightly different angle than I had. We were both sitting on the same bench eating overpriced sandwiches from the cafe in the park, and we'd arrived at the conversation gradually, the way conversations between strangers do when they both witness the same thing and neither has anyone with them to talk about it. First time I saw one do that, she said, meaning the guard's command. 40 years walking past there and I've never heard one shout before. Really? I said. Usually, she said, people notice when they're getting close. Or the other tourists pull them back. Or. She shrugged. Most people have enough sense. She said it without judgment, which I respected. It was just an observation. Did you see the video? I asked. She made a face. I don't do all that. I thought about showing her the still photograph on my camera, the one with the little girl, but then, I decided not to. Some things feel better kept quiet. More real, somehow, for not being shared. We ate our sandwiches. A dog came and looked at us with absolute moral certainty that we should share, and we didn't, and it left in dignified disappointment. You know what they told me once? Diane said, not quite directing it at me, more just thinking aloud. Someone who knew about it said the hardest part of their training isn't the stillness. Anyone can learn to stand still. The hardest part is staying present. In your mind. Not going somewhere else. Being actually here for the whole shift. She looked toward the palace. You could just see the top of it from the bench. Imagine that, she said. Being completely present. 4 hours. I thought about it. She finished her sandwich, folded the wrapper neatly, and stood up. Anyway, she said. She said it the way British people say anyway, which means everything and nothing, and also I'm leaving now. Enjoy the rest of your visit, she said, and she walked off into the park, and I never saw her again. Around midday, I watched the changing of the guard. I'd timed it right by accident. I hadn't planned to stay that long, but somehow I'd not moved, and suddenly, there was music and movement and a whole ceremony unfolding with a precision that took your breath away a little even when you'd seen it in documentaries. My Thomas, was relieved. I watched him march away with his replacement arriving to take his post, and there was something strange and slightly melancholy about it, watching him go. Like the end of a chapter. His replacement was taller. Older, maybe. Different posture, though the training made them all versions of the same thing. The crowd surged forward again, the way crowds do when something official is happening and they feel collectively licensed to be excited. I stayed on the edges. I'd had my morning. I felt strangely full. On my way back through the park, I passed the spot where Marcus had been standing during the confrontation. He was gone, of course. Long gone. But I thought about him for a moment. Not with mockery, the mocking had been done thoroughly enough by the internet by now. Just thought about him. About what it must feel like to have miscalculated something so publicly. About how the please don't woman in his life had been right, and he'd dismissed her, and then, the world had confirmed it in front of 30 strangers and 3 phone cameras. We've all been Marcus in something. Maybe not that exact thing. Maybe not outside a royal palace with a rifle-bearing guard involved. But we've all had the moment where we were so sure the rules were just suggestions, where we were so certain that this particular boundary didn't apply to us, and then something or someone reminded us, firmly, that it did. The memory of it doesn't leave easily. I hope it didn't leave Marcus easily either. Not because I wanted him to suffer. But because those moments, the ones that stick, the ones that sting a little, are often the ones that actually change something in us, if we let them. I stayed in London for 2 more days after that morning. I did the things you do. Borough Market. The Tate. A walk across the Millennium Bridge where the wind was doing its best to rearrange my face. A curry in Brick Lane that was so good I sat in the restaurant for an extra 20 minutes after I'd finished just because I didn't want the experience to be over. But I kept going back to that morning in my head. Not obsessively. Not in the way that keeps you up at night. More like the way a song gets in your head and you find yourself humming it on the tube or catching its melody in the noise of traffic, and you don't mind because it's a good song. I'm going to try to explain something, and I'm aware that it might not come out quite right. I've been traveling since I was in my early 20s. Not expensively, a teacher's salary is what it is, and I'm not complaining, but it doesn't exactly fund a life of 5-star hotels and business class. Hostels, budget flights, cooking in shared kitchens, the kind of travel where you figure things out as you go. 30-odd countries by now, though I've stopped counting because at some point counting starts feeling like the wrong thing to focus on. In all that traveling, the moments that have stayed with me aren't usually the famous things. The things I went specifically to see. The Colosseum at noon surrounded by 1,000 other people with their selfie sticks. The Eiffel Tower on a Saturday. Angkor Wat at the wrong time of year when the crowds were something else entirely. The moments that stay are almost always accidental. The small, unplanned things that happen because you happen to be somewhere at a particular time, and the world showed you something it wasn't advertising. A conversation with an old fisherman in a village in Portugal who didn't speak a word of English and I didn't speak a word of Portuguese, but we somehow communicated our mutual appreciation of the evening light on the water for 20 minutes. A thunderstorm in rural Japan that I sheltered from under the awning of a closed ramen shop with a woman and her daughter, the 3 of us watching the rain in companionable silence. A moment in a small church in Krakow where I sat alone for half an hour and felt something I don't have a word for, some kind of stillness inside the stillness. Thomas was one of those moments. And the little girl in the red coat. And Diane on the bench with her sandwich, saying imagine that being completely present. On my last evening, I walked back down the mall. I don't know why. It was getting dark, gone 6 o'clock, and the tourist crowds had emptied out. The palace was lit up against the darkening sky, and the air had gotten properly cold now, the kind of cold that makes you feel a little more alive because your body has to do something about it. There were maybe a dozen people around the gates. None of them were doing anything wrong. They were just looking, the way you look at something you know you might not see again for a long time, or might not see at all. The guard on duty now was not Thomas. Different person entirely, I could tell from the height, the build. But the posture was the same. The absolute stillness was the same. The commitment was the same. I stood there for a while without taking any photos. Just looked. There's something about a person who is completely committed to what they're doing. Completely present in it, like Diane said. There's something almost restful about being near it. Like their stillness loans you a little of itself. I thought about my classroom. I thought about the Monday morning ahead of me, year 9 after lunch, which is any teacher's particular test of character. I thought about all the small boundary lines that make up a life. The ones you hold. The ones you let slide. The ones that matter more than they look like they matter. I thought about what it means to stand for something so completely that a stranger with a phone camera can't shake you. And I thought about a little girl in a red coat raising her hand to wave at someone who was not supposed to wave back, and the fraction of a second when something human moved across a face that was otherwise made of stone. I went home. Back to my school, my flat, my fraying camera strap. My nephew loved the toy soldier I brought him. He's had it on his shelf ever since, though I noticed last time I visited that it's now been incorporated into some elaborate battle involving Lego and what appears to be a small plastic dinosaur. At school, I told the year 10s about the confrontation. Not as a lecture, I wasn't trying to make a point. It just came up in a conversation about what commands actually feel like versus what orders feel like, which sounds like an odd topic for an English class, but we'd been reading The Remains of the Day and somehow we got there. One of the students, a girl called Priya who was smarter than she usually lets on in class, said something I've written down since. She said, so he didn't even need to be angry. He just had to be sure. Yeah, Priya. That's exactly it. He just had to be sure. The video of the confrontation never went massively viral. It floated around for a few days, picked up maybe 100,000 views on one platform, got shared in a few of those royal family interest groups, and then, the internet moved on as the internet does. Marcus's face was pixelated in most versions, to his probable relief. Someone made a sound effect remix that was briefly popular. Someone else turned "Make Way for the Queen's Guard" into a text alert tone that I briefly considered using but thought better of. I watched one of the videos again, about a month later. My version of events, the one I'd been carrying in my head, had softened the moment slightly. The way memories do, they round the edges, they lose the sharpness. But the video gave it back to me in full. Thomas stepping forward. The sound of that command. The crowd parting. And Marcus, who to his credit, I'll say it, to his genuine credit, had stopped immediately. Had stepped back. Had not argued, not gesticulated, not tried to have some kind of standoff. He'd understood in that moment that there was no standoff to be had, and he'd done the right thing by stepping back. I hadn't given him enough credit for that, actually. I'd been so caught up in his mistake that I'd not properly registered what he did right in the moment after it. I thought about that. We're pretty quick, most of us, to define someone by the moment they got it wrong. We clip that 5-second window and we put it online and we write our comments and we've decided who that person is. But Marcus, whoever he was, whatever his name actually was, he walked away. He didn't double down. He didn't make it worse. He took 3 steps backward and he let it be over. There's something in that too. The photograph, the one with the little girl in the red coat and Thomas in the background, is framed on the wall of my living room. My friend Sophie came over for dinner a few weeks after I got back and she stood in front of it for a long time. "Did you set this up?" she said. "No," I said. "I didn't even know I'd taken it." She looked at it a bit longer. "He doesn't know she's there," she said. "No," I said. "He doesn't. And she thinks he might wave back." "Yeah." Sophie looked at the photograph for another moment. "That's..." She started, and then she stopped, and she just shook her head slightly in that way you do when you can't quite get a feeling into words. "I know. I know. There's a kind of person the world doesn't make enough room for anymore. Someone who stands completely in their role. Who doesn't apologize for it or perform it for attention or use it as a vehicle for something else. Someone who just does it. Properly. With everything they have. We talk a lot about authenticity. About being real. About breaking down walls and being vulnerable and letting people see who you truly are. And I think all of that matters, I do. But I also think there's something we've undervalued in our rush away from the old formalities. There's something in the person who takes seriously the thing they've been given to do. Who shows up for it fully? Who doesn't let the phone cameras, the crowds, the difficult mornings, the gray October skies, the tourists who haven't read the signs, who doesn't let any of it make them smaller or less than what they are? Thomas stood there all morning with everything thrown at him, the noise, the cold, the entitled stranger with the camera, and not one bit of it touched what he'd decided to be. That's not nothing. That might be everything. I went back to London in February. Different reason, a friend's birthday, a show in the West End. But I walked past the palace one morning, not even planning to stop, just happened to be nearby. There was a guard on duty. Not Thomas, or at least, I don't think it was Thomas. I couldn't be certain from the distance, and I didn't get close enough to try to tell. But, just seeing the uniform, the stillness, the morning light on the red and gold of it, I stopped for a second. Just a second. And I thought about what Diane had said on the bench, with her sandwich, looking off toward the palace, thinking aloud, imagine that. Being completely present. 4 hours. The traffic was moving behind me. Someone bumped my shoulder walking past. A pigeon landed 3 feet away and looked at me with its mad, orange pigeon eyes. And, for just a moment, standing there on the pavement, I tried. I tried to be completely present. To be just here. Just in this moment. Just in this city, this morning, this breath. It lasted maybe 30 seconds before my phone buzzed and the moment was gone. But, for those 30 seconds, I think I understood something. The world will always have its Marcuses. People who don't read the signs. Who mistake patience for permission. Who push until something pushes back. But, the world also has its guards. The ones who hold the line. Not for ego. Not for applause. Not because it's easy or comfortable or appreciated. Just because someone has to. And they decided it would be them. Maybe that's the whole story. Maybe that's enough of one.